Hey everybody, welcome to our very first edition of In the Image of God, Conversations About Race. Most of you know me. My name is Andrew Lupton. I serve as one of the pastors here at the United Church of Bogota. It is such a privilege to have this conversation with you. Now, we're calling this a conversation, one, because we have panelists who are going to dialogue about the image of God, race, and racial injustice, but also because we want you to contribute to the conversation. So, how can you do that? Well, if you will look underneath this video, you're going to see a link. Victoria, maybe you can post that link in the chat and I'll throw it up on the screen. You'll see a link there to click to our VVox. That's where you can ask our panelists anonymous questions, okay? So if you're worried about asking a dumb question, don't worry about it. Ask anything. If you see a question that's there that you really want to be asked, go ahead and press like on that question and it will rank them so we can see which questions you, our audience, would like to have answered. So I've got that app up on my phone. I can see your questions as you put them up. And we will get to as many of them as we can. We want this to take about an hour tonight. And like I said, this is the first episode, meaning, Lord willing, we will have more episodes to cover more aspects of the image of God and race and racial injustice. So we should start, I think, by talking about the image of God, shouldn't we? It was January 10th. 2012 at a hospital in Cary, North Carolina at about 6:30 a.m. That's when I first laid eyes on him, on my son, Fox. I'll never forget that day in the hospital and what was going on in my heart. A lot of happy tears were shed as I met him, as I looked over him, his big blue eyes, the way his ears kind of stuck out. His cute little chin. It was love at first sight. And as I've thought about that experience, I think that this is as close an experience that we humans will have of making someone in our own image. And I like to think that maybe, just maybe, I tasted a little bit of what it was like for our triune God to make mankind in his image, to look over Adam, his creation, the eyes, the ears, the chin, and to feel love at first sight, to feel enamored with his creation, to be able to say, very good on that sixth day of creation. This idea of the image of God comes from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, where we read, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Well, when I looked at Fox, I thought this to myself: he is like me. And it's not just that he looks like me. His voice, the way his voice would develop, his mannerisms, his name, his little personality as it developed, he is like me. And that's how it is with God. It's not that we look like God, who we are told is spirit. It's that we reflect something of our Creator. John Calvin said that Adam, being made in the image of God, resembles him, and that in him God's glory is contemplated as in a mirror. Think about that. God's glory is contemplated as in a mirror. In the first chapter of God's big story of redemption, that chapter is called creation. That's the state of man, reflecting clearly the image of God, full glory, dignity, and worth. No one needed to ask me when my son was born, hey, does his life matter? I would have said, yes, of course it matters, if anybody asked me. I had just met the little guy, and I would have died for him. Listen, every single person made in the image of God matters, is full of glory, dignity, and worth from God, their maker. But in chapter 2 of God's big story of redemption, we'll call that chapter Rebellion, something changed, sadly. Someone took a hammer to that mirror And so now it's all cracked and splintered. It's all distorted. And that, Genesis chapter 3, rebellion is the starting point of racial injustice and really all the sin that we commit against each other because we fail to see the glory, the dignity, the worth of God in someone, typically who is different than me. But there's chapter 3. This is why we call it God's big story of redemption. That's the name of this chapter, the central event of human history. All human history is when God, the Son of God, Jesus, clothed himself in our image. This God-man lived a life of never having his vision of the glory of God, the dignity, the worth, the glory of other image bearers distorted by cracks in the mirror. He could see our brokenness in all of its sadness, but he could see the glory too. And he longed for it to all be fixed. So he went to the cross to atone for all the cracks, for us, for all the cracks in the mirror. We're living in that third chapter of redemption. And we're living before the fourth chapter called restoration. That's when Jesus will return to make all things brand new. No more cracks. No more distorted image bearers. No more racial injustice. Just a clear reflection of the glory of God and living in eternity with God. Tonight, we're not going to solve racial injustice. None of us on the panel are experts. I'm not an expert at moderating. But we are going to have a conversation. And you are going to see us take the posture of learners, craving that glory, dignity, worth restored. You are going to see us attempt to take the posture of humility. And we just may, through a series of conversations like this, see a few of those cracks restored. We just may see the image of God a little more clearly, and therefore the God who loves us a little more clearly. So let me pray as we start this. Lord, we come to you as learners, as non-experts, as people made in your image, longing for restoration, longing for healing in our broken world. And we plead with you tonight to give us a taste of that. Please give us a good conversation. Give us good internet and good connection and communication, and teach us your ways, Lord. Please teach us your beautiful ways. This we pray in our Savior's name, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so we have a panel. I want to give a special shout out, first of all, to Lauren Jones, who was supposed to be one of our panel members. And for whatever reason, my technology could handle 4 panel members, but not 5. And so Lauren graciously at the last minute said, "Hey, I'll bump off, and you can add me at a future panel," and we will absolutely do that. So thank you, Lauren. Panelists, I'm going to get you up on the screen right now. There we go. My mic is working, and I would love for you all to introduce yourselves. So we'll just go in the order of my screen and our viewer screen, and we'll start up with Justin. Justin, I want you to introduce yourself and then just briefly tell us, how has racial injustice been a part of your story?
My name is Justin Willis. I'm a member of United Church of Bogota, and that to ask that question to an African American like myself, I would say short answer: racial injustice has impacted and saturated every part of my life, even ancestrally. Um, but what I can say is, for example, globally, when I've lived in countries abroad, when the locals would try to get to know me, they would ask questions that sort of boxed me in as an individual. Some questions like, "Can you rap?" or um, do you play basketball? You know, those types of questions to sort of box me in as an individual. And they didn't, what I found out is that they didn't know too much about my culture. And in the US, looking at my ancestry being dragged to the United States, of America that has serious implications of how my ancestors were treated and how I'm treated. I'm not first generation African American. My mother and father, they're African American. My grandparents are African American, and so I come from that lineage of oppression and trying to work twice as harder to be heard, to be understood, and be valued as an American and as a human being. And so that's been part of my story with racial injustice.
Thanks, Justin. Tatiana, will you introduce yourself to our viewers, please, and answer the question, how has racial injustice been a part of your story?
Sure. My name is Tatiana. I'm from Colombia. And I think it's a kind of interesting response because the majority of my life, I think I grew up not really thinking about race as much. It was a topic that was not really talked about growing up where I grew up in Bogota. Definitely felt some subtle hints of kind of light skinned versus more brown skin here. Growing up in a high school and a school that was mostly people with lighter skin than mine and had direct parents that were European descent or American descent, definitely felt a little bit of a, I don't know, different treatment sometimes. But then once I went to the US, I think I had my first experience with the topic about race. And I think it shocked me because I had no idea how to fit myself into a culture where that was so heavy and prevalent. And I definitely felt boxed similarly to Justin as like, oh, like Latina, like Mexican, we like all of these things. And I'm like, what? Like, so it has been very recent and this past, I would say maybe, 7 to 5 years that I have definitely been praying and asking God to reveal more about this topic that I think it's so important to understand in the church and in the world.
Very good. Thank you, Tatiana. Ingrid, would you introduce yourself and also answer the question, how has racial injustice been a part of your story?
Good evening. My name is Ingrid. I've been a member of UCB for 5 years, and probably my story is similar than Tatiana's, but I have a very different approach because I'm not exactly sure if I have been a victim or culpable of racism. I don't even know what my race is because race and racism, well, for me, are cultural concepts mostly informed by North American scholarship and culture and tradition. And yes, if, for example, I'm going to the United States and filling a form there, I will find a box with the tag Latino or brown, and I would have to take it. But would that kind of box have any sense here in Colombia, as most of us are Latino and brown? So this is a problem I had when replying to a census here in Colombia, a census survey. When it comes to race, we all here are mestizos. We're more or less native traces in our blood. So for giving you a clear example of what I mean by this and why I prefer avoid using the term race and using another one, which is discrimination or even segregation. There's a silly example. I can't forget a Sunday after church when I was living in Paris several years ago, when some sisters and I went to have lunch with someone else, and I met there a beautiful black girl. I think that I am allowed here to use the term black, right? Because I'm not being offensive at all. And during our conversation, at some point, she said, because people white like you. And I said, what? I couldn't help laughing at that moment because it was the first time someone referred to me as white. But after that episode, I started to meditate on how I can determine what race, sorry, I belong to. If I have to do a DNA test for measuring the amount of melanin particles in my skin, or the level of darkness of my hair or eyes, or the quantity of African or indigenous chromosomes in my genetic chains. So I really think that race is something as relative as the concept of beauty. So it depends on the context. We can call it apartheid or anti-Semitism or whatever. So that's why I prefer to talk about segregation here.
That's great, Ingrid. Thank you very much. Dave, introduce yourself and answer the question, how has racial injustice been a part of your story, please?
Thanks, Andrew. So my name is Dave Linsenmeyer. I'm one of the elders at UCB. I've been here in Columbia about 2.5 years. I grew up on the edge of Chicago in a very diverse neighborhood, maybe 40% Black, 40% white, and 20% other, which was a huge amount of diversity within that other. And I think I started asking questions when I was about 8 years old about difference. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was actually asking questions about culture more than I was asking questions about race. In my life, I have most of the time been in the racial group that has the privilege, and I started understanding that maybe a little bit as a teenager, and understanding it more as I grew, and trying to understand, well, how did that happen? Part of the interesting question in my own story about how that happened is, it's not true of all of my ancestors. My mother's family are Jewish, and if you go back just a couple of generations, they were in Eastern Europe and persecuted, sent to concentration camps. But somehow my family became white. So that idea of culture and race and prejudice and power and privilege, and what can we do about that? How could we get to a place of equality has been a question I've been struggling with for more than 30 years. I don't think I know the answer, but I have a lot of thoughts about it.
All right, thanks, Dave. Jeremy chimes in here to say that questions in VVox don't seem to be showing up. And yeah, Jeremy, I'm noticing that too. I'm just thinking, are we terribly unengaging, or are you people just, are you having some technical issues? So then I'm not exactly sure why that is. Victoria can check that out to see. But if you feel bold enough to not make your question anonymous and to put it in the live chat here, that's the easiest way for me to see your question. So I'm sorry about that, everybody. This is our first time, and we even tried it out last week. So not too sure why we're having issues there. So Victoria's going to check on that. But post your questions in the live chat if you feel comfortable doing that. She has the login to our VVox, so I will log out to Victoria so that you can get into it. Very good. All right. So, some people may be wondering why are we having this conversation now? Why do this now? So I wonder if we could start up with Justin. Justin, from your perspective, why are we having this conversation? Why is this an important thing for us as a church to be talking about right now?
Part of the reason why we're having this conversation now as a church is because racism is being discussed around the world as well. And I think that it's important to see how the church responds. It's a chance for us to come together, to pray together, to check in on one another, and to respond properly and in a loving way to combat racism that has been going on actually for as long as I've been on God's green earth, but way longer than that. And in my opinion, it's a past due conversation, but a conversation that is necessary, and one that's not done individually, but corporately and together on one accord.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Justin. This is past due. And, in some senses, when we talked as the elders, Justin is leading us in this conversation. We wondered, should we make a statement? Like you see some people publishing statements, and we thought, well, let's do our best to model a conversation instead of making a statement, because how in the world could we capture what needs to be said sensitively that would stand the test of time and the internet, that would make our relatively diverse church and the people that we want to see included in our church feel valued and feel dignified. And we thought, man, we just need to talk. And yeah, so Justin, that is well said. It is a past due conversation for us to have. Tatiana, what about from your perspective? Why are we having this conversation right now?
I could agree with Justin. I think that there has been specific events recently, mostly in the United States and let's say also in Colombia, but not as known, of injustice, of racial injustice, specifically involving African Americans or Afro-Colombians. And I think it kind of has sparked a lot of kind of conversations that for the past years people have been trying to have, and it's been like, I don't even know where to start. How do we, say this? As we saw, all of us come from very different backgrounds, experiences, and sometimes understanding where one of you might come, I have no idea how do you manage to think that way or to arrive to that conclusion. So I think it's painful to see what's been going on around the world, but I'm actually very thankful that God has placed us in an uncomfortable position to face this, because there's so much pain and there's so much hurt and so many events historically and still happening that I think even though we don't know how to address, we should start by even, opening up the room and saying, this is a problem, this exists. Even though I might not understand exactly where you come from, we need to all come together and be able to see each other as God sees us and manage a way to talk about this very painful subject in a way that is bringing some reconciliation. So I think the reason why we're doing it right now and the church is doing it right now is because it is kind of like out in the air now. Like before, I think it was something that was a little bit more kind of masked or undercover, or people would know that it exists, but it was like, let's not talk about it. But because of the recent events that happened in the US, with some cases involving police brutality, people around the globe have, started protesting and really asking the hard questions and asking for justice, not just for justice as a conversation, but in our political systems, like in our systems, the way that we live, why these people ended up living in these neighborhoods, why this other people ended up in this situation, like all of this, like kind of systemic problems have been addressed. And I think it's the perfect place for the church to start talking about it.
Good. Dave, I want your answer on this too, but I'd love to hear, Ingrid, your response to why are we having this conversation first?
Well, I think the question is already answered. Tatiana and Justin, I do agree, and I also think that this conversation should have started before, even several months ago. Last year in Colombia, around 250 people were murdered, and most of them like social leaders, and most of them were from Afro-Colombian communities or indigenous communities. So this is a very serious conversation, but I would like to change a little bit the question by how should we have this conversation, or why, should we have this conversation? And it's because we both can be victims or culpables. And I think that I would like to put another example from my life. I'm continuing with this story of my life abroad, my life in France. When I moved there, I never had seen so many Black people around me, but never had seen so many Asians neither, or Muslims, or even Latin Americans from other countries. So I always consider myself as a victim of discrimination due to my appearance. My skin was darker than most of my family members, and sometimes my own relatives were using words for making clear this difference, but it wasn't intentional. They didn't notice that, and it turned to be very offensive to me. So um, when I went to France and I started to interact with people from other countries, they asked me, "Where are you from? Are you from Peru? Are you from Ecuador? Are you from Bolivia?" And when it happened, I got mad to them because in Colombia, for a reason that I still ignore, we used to think that every was like a cholo, which is a pejorative slang for indigenous, and that we were prettier according to standards or wider. I don't know why, but well, that still happens. And I think that that reaction showed me that I was very mature at that time. I was a teenager, but I also was discriminating people. I was sinning. I was segregating them because but very similar to the people that bullied me in school.
Thank
So that's why I think that we should have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's it's risky to be able to talk about ways that you have assumed the posture of sometimes the villain, and we have all been there. At least I can't speak for everybody, but I would assume that we have all been there in that setting. So thank you. That's a very good concrete example. I really appreciate that. Dave, go ahead. I really appreciated listening to you reflect on this question about why now.
Yeah, for me, why now is everything that the three of you have said. Completely agree. The thing that I want to add that's a hope, and I don't know if this will happen, but I really hope this will happen, is this conversation has been going on for generations, but it might be the case that this moment is different. It might be the case that at this moment we actually can change our culture and change ourselves. And so I hope we can actually change our broader culture to a place that is more loving of each other and more celebrating of our differences. But I know that we can change ourselves because that's true in any situation of sin. Now, we can't change ourselves on our own, right? We need the work of the Holy Spirit with us, which is why this should be the work of the church. And part of my reflection on this, and Ingrid, I really appreciate your story about this, and I can tell some of my own stories as well, is I do think that we are all prejudiced, that we all have bias. If you've studied psychology, right, one of the first things children learn is to separate things into similar and different. This gets learned by age 2, and you learn from the culture around you, from your parents, from your friends, from your teachers, how to interpret those differences. And we live in a fallen world, and we are sinful people, and so we don't do that with love. We do that in an environment of sin. And if we want to actually love our neighbor as ourselves, well, that's going to require work and conversation and conversation with the Holy Spirit speaking with us as well to teach us that, because it's not what we were necessarily taught by the cultures we grew up in or by our parents or by our friends. That's something we need actually to teach each other now in this Christian context.
Dave said something. He spoke for all of us. He said we all practice some form of discrimination. Would you panelists agree with that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of there's so many good questions on the now working Vivox app. So thank you everybody for submitting those. Somebody asks, as a Christian, how should we view the Black Lives Matter movement? And Justin, you and I have spoken about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So, as a Christian, how should we view the Black Lives Matter movement? And you may need to explain a little bit. I'm assuming most people uh, see a lot of U.S. news because we get a lot of exposure around the world, especially the broken bits about the U.S. So you may need to explain a little bit of the context, but yeah, I'd love to hear your reflections on that, Justin.
Right. So I want to begin a bit about what the Black Lives Matter movement is not. It's not a terrorist group. It's not some nationalist, radical organization out to get people. It's a response to the continuous outcry and plight of the African American community in the United States in the 21st century. And so, how to contextualize that a bit more is Martin Luther King Jr.'s plight and fight was saying, when you boil it down, Black Lives Matter. It's the same approach. I mean, it's a different approach, but it's the same message. And so, for a Christian wondering how to respond to that, I would say prayer, in praying on how to further and better understand the movement. I would also say that you should continue to watch and read and seeing how the Black Lives Matter movement is moving in and around areas of social injustice on the news, and what's being done to combat racism. I would not encourage anyone to I would not encourage anyone to kill or be fueled by hatred of any kind, but rather, study and follow what that movement is standing for. When you really boil it down, it's an outcry to say that our voices, our lives, have not been valued. Our when you turn on the TV, you're seeing more evidence of the African American lives, Black lives, not being valued than valued. And so, our frustration and our anger has turned into this movement in recent years. And when you see it happen, it's usually after police brutality or a killing of yet another African American male or African American woman. And so I would say, as a Christian trying to understand the Black Lives Matter movement, what you essentially want to do is try to better understand Black lives. And that's done by what David was saying was, speaking to your brothers and sisters who are African American, listening to them intently and loving them kindly, as God would love them, to better understand what their plight is, better understand what they want. They don't want to tear down buildings. They don't want to harm you. They want to be understood. They want to be loved. They want to be valued here on earth, here and now.
Thank you, Justin. What I hear you saying is we need to love our African American friends, and we need to learn, and that happens by listening to them. But are there some resources perhaps that you recommend if it's somebody who is new to this conversation? Tatiana was saying now is an important moment in history because now everybody's paying attention. And maybe it's because we're all stuck in our homes in some way or another, and we have our attention in God's providence, and maybe we have some bandwidth and even some, I hope, empathy, and so we can engage this a little more. Or now maybe it's at a different tipping point because it's so egregious, and the George Floyd tragedy was just, it was on video, so it's not, you can't hide it, you can't spin it really, it's there. Somebody like that, brand new to the conversation, what's the first book or two that they're going to pick up, or podcast, or if it's a YouTube series, whatever it may be? How would you recommend our friends learn about the Black experience in America, North America?
Some of my favorite books, resources that I've used and often go back to are both from Michael Eric Dyson. The first I can think of is Tears We Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America. And his most recent book, I want to say, is called What the Truth Sounds Like. And that's basically looking back at American history and seeing what the conversation looked like when it comes to the plight of African Americans and what the fights looked like decades ago. Those are a few resources that I would share, and there are plenty more resources and podcasts. But at the end of the day, if you know an African American woman or an African American male, I think that's the gym to go to try to glean more and really feel what they feel, hear what they experience, and walk with them in their experiences as well.
Dyson, Dyson. Okay. And is that from a Christian perspective, Justin?
The first one, yes, it's from his perspective. He is a Christian. He's a believer in Christ. He does preach, and so his material is sound. It's not in the label of Christian, but it does have a lot of solid insight on how brothers and sisters in Christ can better understand and walk with love to their Black brothers and sisters.
Okay, thank you. I'd love to hear from either Tatiana or Ingrid. What is it like as a Colombian to hear of the Black Lives Matter movement? And just because I'm from the U.S. and so I feel some ownership, much ownership actually. And I'm just curious, what is it like to be a Colombian and to hear this news and then to see it travel south? I don't know which of you would like to take a stab at that.
I can start if you want. So I will say I have a very interesting perspective to it because I was actually living in Baltimore when some of the police brutality events happened in 2015, I think. And that was the first time that I actually heard of Black Lives Matter, and I was living in the city. We got locked down in our school. Classes were canceled. There was a bunch of rioting and protesting and craziness in the city. And so that was the first time I actually encountered this, and it was very weird to me. I had no idea how to respond to it. I was afraid, and at the same time, I had friends that were African American, and they were hurting so much, and just what you said, Justin, just sitting with them, and as someone that is not from the U.S., getting educated in the history and everything was so great for me to just have at least an introduction to why this is such a heavy topic and why some people get sometimes offended when they say Black Lives Matter, and I'm like understanding why, there's two perspectives to it, and some people, being very strong about this and others actually being offended. So that was my first experience, and now coming back to Colombia and being here and now experiencing what happens in Minneapolis, and my husband Derek is from Minneapolis, and so he was like feeling very heavy this time being far away from home and seeing his streets and all of that, what was happening. So we actually had just like interesting perspectives of what happened 5 years ago and now. And so as a Colombian, I think I feel kind of stuck in the middle because I started to wonder, why is this not a conversation here? Like, why? I have no idea of the history of our Afro-Colombian brothers and sisters. I have no idea. I mean, I didn't grow up around an Afro-Colombian community, and generally the people that I saw there were Afro-Colombian, were either in the coast when I went to vacation, or in the streets in Bogota, sadly. Like, that was kind of my perspective of just seeing Afro-Colombians. And so this actually has gotten me to really educate myself about our country and racism in Colombia, because we don't talk about it. And I actually, I was ignorant before, and people would ask me, how is, race dynamics in Colombia? And I'm like, I don't think they exist. I mean, there's like sometimes, more of like a social class dynamic, but I don't think it, like specific like racism exists in Colombia. And that is so not true, because I just had the fact that I grew up in an area, and in a privileged area in the city where, I didn't get to learn as much about minorities in my country, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So the Black Lives Matter movement, to me, actually has inspired me as a Colombian to start the conversation. And it might look extremely different because our history is different. As Ingrid was saying, race for us is very different. We don't really categorize ourselves if you're like, white or brown. You mostly categorize Afro-Colombians and indigenous, but the rest of the country is like whatever. So it actually, gotten me to study Afro-Colombian history, study how like slavery came here, how people were treated, indigenous people too, and do my own research of my country and my own privilege being of the majority of mestizos in Colombia.
Yeah, thank you, Tatiana. Ingrid, would you like to add to that? I'm going to pitch over to you just because a number of the questions in our panel are asking. So yeah, what is this like in Colombia? So I'd love to hear your perspective, Ingrid.
Well, I have very little to add. Well, it would be very responsible from me because I never lived in the States, so just giving opinions like that about that movement. But what I can see from the media, from the social networks, is that this powerful and horrible image of George Floyd's death have been used also for leading other discourses like LGBTI rights, Me Too movement, so even political interest. So that really, I'm really concerned about that. So I understand all the philosophy behind these, and I also feel like identified with this longing for life and justice, social justice. But for example, just for giving an example, in Chile, there's demonstrations with slogans as Mapuche Lives Matters, which is an indigenous community. So making all these problems, all these issues is important, but what I think that is that the abusive use of those images in media can banalize his death and other deaths that have been recorded. So I'm just concerned about the use of them and the way they can be feeding hate discourses, and the way they can be used just for polarizing even more our society, because there's this tendency of thinking that if I disagree with X is because I'm in favor of Y, which is not true. Things are much more complex than that. So yeah.
So Ingrid, just so I understand what you're saying, you're nervous that the George Floyd image, right? So there's some pretty iconic street art now that makes its way around social media. You're nervous that that's going to be appropriated for other movements, and therefore it will lose its value.
I think it isn't the process. It's on his way. I've seen so many opinions on Twitter. So yeah, lacking of information behind this, and even respect. And yeah, it's like well, my invitation would be for people, as Justin was saying, do not embrace a cause like this without knowledge, without informing you first, trying to understand both positions, because otherwise it would be only joining because it's a vogue, because it's a tendency.
Tatiana or Ingrid, I'm wondering if there is a book, a podcast, something that you would recommend someone who's new to the conversation, they could learn about the Afro-Colombian experience, or perhaps the experience of indigenous people in Colombia and racial injustice.
Do you want me to reply first? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I don't have a book specifically. I found, doing my research, I found just some talks in YouTube by this Afro-Colombian educator on just the history, just plain history, because I mean, we don't even learn this in school. It's really embarrassing. The history of where, like how Afro-Colombian communities came geographically to be placed where they're placed in Colombia, and why obviously these areas are the most impoverished of, some of the most impoverished of Colombia. So I actually wrote a blog on this, and it's in my business website journal, and that's where you can find the videos of this man. I can give you the name of him. It's like a long name, so I can get back to you on that, but I'll give you the website so that people can access that blog post.
Yeah, we can post it under the video. I read that when you wrote it, Tatiana, and that was very helpful and brand new information. So, yeah, Ingrid.
Yeah, for me it was great.
Yeah, the Justicia. I don't know if you know that organization. It's a Center of Studies in Right. They have many studies on this issue, and one which is very interesting to me because of my profession and this idea of segregation and social segregation is related to housing and residential segregation. So I have the link here, and I can share it with you if you want to.
Yeah, I can stick that under our video once we wrap up. So, Dr. Dave, I mean, I could pitch this to Dr. Ingrid too, because we've got a couple PhDs on the chat. This is a longer question. I'm just going to pull a part of it, and basically, the question is why is race an ism? So, why is it something that Christians need to take seriously when it can't be studied scientifically? Maybe you disagree with that statement, but I'd be curious. We had a ton of geeky people in our church, and so that's not the first time I've heard that question. So if it can't be studied scientifically, then why do we need to engage as Christians, or can it be studied scientifically?
Well, I think I would say it depends on where you draw the boundaries of science, right? So as a social scientist, I would say race and racism absolutely can be studied scientifically, and if you look, at least in the U.S., which is where I've done more research on income, education, health outcomes, nutrition, life expectancy, you find strong correlations between race and any of those things, and they're statistically significant, and you can measure them in all kinds of different ways. But I think as a Christian, I actually don't go to what can be studied scientifically or what can't. As a Christian, I go to what is God's call, right? And Jesus was asked, what are the most important commandments? And he said, first, love the Lord your God. Okay, no racism involved in that. God doesn't have a race. Second, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, and now we have to talk about racism, because racism holds people back from loving their neighbors as themselves. Racism holds me back from loving my neighbors as myself. As I was, and I said I'd share a little bit more of a story. As I, so I'm thinking about being 8 or 9 years old in a classroom with a diverse group of kids, and seeing that the black kids get sent to the principal's office more often. Why? And one of my first observations was for talking too loud. And I thought, this is a very naive observation from an 8-year-old. Why is, why are they talking too loud, right? Why are those people misbehaving in class? Extend that thought to even the perspective of, a couple years later, realizing, why do we have a standard about how loud you're supposed to talk? Why does that even matter, right? This was, it's a very, and it's almost a stupid example, but what we were doing was imposing one cultural norm about a pattern of speech and using that cultural norm to oppress another group of people, using that cultural norm to label another group of people as bad. Talking louder, softer, singing, like, this is all this. Why should that affect how we see our neighbors? And yet, this is me at the age of 8, being taught inadvertently, perhaps, but being taught by my teachers that this group of people is bad because they're talking loud. And so, coming back to love your neighbor as yourself, was something that I realized even as a kid I had to work on, to realize that the culture around me and the pressure and even the teaching I was getting from my teachers was pushing against that commandment of God. And I think for me that connects to this. I wanted to say one thing about Black Lives Matter as well, which is people are saying, well, don't all lives matter? Why are we saying Black Lives Matter? Don't all lives matter? And of course the answer is yes, all lives matter. The reason we have to say Black Lives Matter is because not everyone is behaving that way all the time. Because, as Justin said, people are crying out and not being heard, which means being treated like their lives don't matter. And I think, again, going back to Jesus's example, he came to people, he came to save all of us, but he spent a lot of time with people who were in particular need, with people who were being downtrodden, people who were being oppressed, people who were being put on the sidelines. He made a point about including the Samaritans. He made a point about actually the Samaritan being the neighbor of the man who was lying in the gutter. And he made a point of the righteous man crossing the other side of the road. And that image of crossing to the other side of the road when you see someone who doesn't look just right, that image is still here 2,000 years later. And we know what Jesus would have done because he told us. That's why we have to talk about Black Lives Matter. Of course, all lives matter. That's absolutely true, but it's not interesting. We have to talk about Black Lives Matter because otherwise there are forces that would make us forget.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Justin, I mean, Dave, you answered a question in part on the chat here. I'm thinking more, so Dave and Justin, you guys are both elders charged like me with shepherding God's people. And that's a very full and beautiful answer, Dave. Is there anything you would add to it, Justin? The way this question is phrased is, how should we as Christians respond to our fellow Christian brothers and sisters who say things like all lives matter or blue lives matter? And I've seen that a couple times. I've not looked into if there's a particular reference to that or if that's just an absurdity thrown into the question. But Justin, how would you, we're not just saying like defeating the argument, but how do you shepherd that person?
Right. Well, I think if there were someone, in the church or even outside the church, come up to me and say, well, don't all lives matter or don't blue lives matter, I would try to, in a conversation or in a shepherding conversation, I would do my best to try to understand where they're coming from, where they heard the rhetoric, and what their heart is saying. I mean, this goes past the hashtag of all lives matter. This goes past the notion of blue lives matter. Trying to get to where their heart is. And by understanding where their heart is or what their experiences are with racism, I think I can help to better shepherd them in the direction of being more like Christ. So it's that if I'm doing it the right way, those hashtags, those saying, those phrases should trigger me to try to get to their heart. So that way it wouldn't just be a debate. It wouldn't be a very explosive conversation to where both parties are being pushed away. But it's listening and trying to get to the matter of understanding more to where their heart is.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Emma helped me out here. Blue Lives Matter refers to the lives of police officers. Yes, that I remember that now. So thank you, Emma Jones. It's good to have you in the chat, by the way, and watching this. Yeah, there's so much. I'm looking at our time here, and there's so much I want to talk about and more conversations I want to have. So I've seen a few posts about this, Justin, and they're quoting from the Black Lives Matter website, right? So I expect you've seen some of this too. Quote, "We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement." And I read through some of this too, and that does actually come from the website, and some other things too that people are citing as why Christians should not be involved. In fact, we should make sure we distance ourselves from Black Lives Matter. So the question is, shouldn't we condemn this if it's got statements like this in it? And as an elder of our church, can you really be embracing Black Lives Matter?
As an elder of my of a church, as an elder of my church, I do believe Black Lives Matter. This is when I was going back and saying that when you boil it down and when you look at what sparked the movement, you would see that this is another way in recent years of what the outcry of the Black community looks like. And so this is another reason why I encourage everyone to not just blindly subscribe to a movement, but to speak to your African American brothers and sisters, to listen to them, to try to understand what they are really saying, to go past the hashtag. And so I've said that earlier, and I stand by that. And yes, Black lives do matter.
Yeah, and if I can just add a comment to that, I think, as Ingrid was referring to, and any image, any hashtag, any movement can be used for any range of purposes, and no human movement is going to be 100% righteous, right? And Black Lives Matter is not a Christian movement, but the concept of have people created in the image of God who are crying out to be heard because of their suffering, that requires a Christian response. And the Christian response to that is to hear their suffering and then to try to do something about it. Exactly what you do about it, and what is the policy solution? Okay, that's a complicated answer and we could debate that. But do we need to care about this? I think as a Christian, the answer to that is clearly yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Ingrid, did you want to add to that?
Yes. Well, listening to you guys, I was thinking also that this is not a call for joining a movement. This is not my invitation because I don't even know it deeply. But I do think that this is the opportunity for reflecting and meditating on our history as a Christian church, and especially in America, or I would say in the Americas, where all this race concept started. And I was recently listening to a podcast, NPR's podcast, which is called, well, it's a show, All Things Considered. And last week they had a very good show about the origin of white supremacism, sorry, in the American church. So this is the opportunity for looking back and looking to our own defaults in order to grow as a church with this auto-criticism.
Yeah,
Yeah, sorry. I want to say something about that. Yeah, very quickly. I totally agree with Ingrid. I think it's not a movement, but it is a conversation that Christians have to be in. Like, I actually think that when we're not involved, it's more probably harmful, because this has to do with loving your neighbor. This has to do with what does it look like to love your neighbor. And so if Christians are not involved in a conversation as this, I think it is actually, like, tends to give the wrong impression to people that are probably seeking truth and trying to find God. With that, I will leave you guys with an incredible book that I have been reading. It is specifically to the US, but I think it can be applied to the Americas in general. It is called Unsettling Truths, and it is by Mark Charles and Sung Chan Ra. It is specifically about discovery and how back, like before colonization, when they came to colonize the Americas, the concept of discovery and the concept of colonization, how that basically impacted all of our lives and all of our societies, and that has led to racism and led to all of these kind of systemic like ways of behaving in the church and outside the church. And it is written by a Christian author, but it is not specifically, it has a lot of layers to them, and it's been really enlightening to me. So I definitely recommend it.
Thank you, Tatiana. I see Jenny Lopez here. Jenny is a former member, and her husband was a deacon a few years ago. Bill, hey Jenny. She chimes in on the live chat here. I recommend taking an implicit bias test, the skin tone IAT. And so I have seen, I understand what you're referencing, but I put it up on the screen here. She says the results surprised me, being a Latina immigrant daughter of a black man. Being self-aware of our own biases is the first step we have to cultural humility so that we can be empathetic and support our black brothers and sisters. Thank you, Jenny, for that, and say hey to your family. We miss you guys. All right, we have gone over time here, and so there's lots of information in the live chat. People are posting their great questions here. And on the Vivox app. I can't thank all of you enough for joining the conversation here. We are going to have more conversations like this, and actually having your questions here really does help shape future versions, future episodes of this. So I'm thinking like, holy smokes, how do we talk about race with the next generation? Let's talk about economic inequality. Yeah, I do want to get into, we've got to talk about white privilege. We've got great questions about what should I do if I feel guilty, if I feel shameful about this. And there's so much to talk about. And this is a great starting point for our conversation. And as it continues from here, I would just encourage you to engage it with humility. With movement, somebody in the conversation actually said, it's helpful to differentiate between a movement and an organization, and I would agree with that. My take on this is it is so helpful to come to something, anything, right? Baxley chimes in because things are so polarized, yes, and also because we live in a sinful world and our hearts are all screwed up. To look at anything and say, what can I affirm here? And do that first. What can I affirm here? What is it that matches God's value system here? And now what can I challenge? And because some of this stuff is not, I can't get on board with some of this stuff, but I can get on board with the affirming stuff, and I want to be a person who affirms the things that God affirms. I hope that we've taken some steps in that direction this evening. Baxley closes us out with a passage. my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And that's a good word to finish here. So, to our panelists, thank you so, so much. I appreciate your time, your energy, your agility as we shifted things up at the last minute with our tech. I can't thank you enough. And to those of you who spent an hour and 5 minutes with us tonight, thank you very much. We'll have another one of these in about a month. And so just stay tuned to our YouTube channel. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't, and give this video a like so others can find it more easily. And I wonder, Justin, could I put you on the spot and ask you to pray for our church in this regard?
Absolutely. Okay, let's pray. Dear Lord, we want to start off by thanking you for your sovereignty and you being all powerful. You designed it that way. And yes, we are part of your creation. And so we want to pray tonight that what we've added to a conversation that has been going on, not only in decades and in other countries and in different spaces, but we pray that ultimately you would be in the conversation, you would be in our acts, you would be in our words, and that our love would reflect your love. To be honest, without you, this conversation is completely and utterly useless. We're wasting our time if you aren't in our lives, if you aren't working through us. And so that's what we want, to represent you in Christ likeness, to love our brothers and sisters better. And so as we continue to talk more about racism, social injustice, our experiences, sharing questions, and reading and listening, and talking. Be with us, prepare us, and yeah, I just pray that this conversation would bring about more things to honor you, because that's the goal. We believe this and receive it in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, panelists, I'll ask you to stay on the Skype call for just a second. And to the rest of you, thanks again. God bless you. Have a great week. We'll see you on Wednesday night at 8 p.m. for our midweek devotional, Saturday at 3 for UCB on Mission, and of course, Sunday morning at 11 a.m. God bless you. Take care.